just for background, we're talking specifically about like low carbohydrate nutrition. So, for me, I've been following a low carbohydrate diet for coming up on 12 years, actually, I believe in November. And when I first kind of got into it, it was kind of in that phase of the Volek and Finney years. Like Dr. Dominic D'Agostino was starting to get some recognition for some of his work. And it felt like this sort of I was obviously aware that this wasn't a new thing. Like low carbohydrate ketogenic diets had been around for a long time, but it was sort of like this next wave of that sort of way of eating, getting a new, fresh set of interest in presumably some new topics. One of them being or categories, I should say, one of them being endurance sport. And it was kind of like, this is cool. This is exciting. I've got a lot of curiosities. It seemed to work well with my lifestyle. So then I was invested from a personal standpoint as well to kind of keep learning about it. And it just seems like as it has grown and gone from something where, like, if you said ketogenic diet 12 years ago, or even low carbohydrate diet, you'd probably have to follow that up with a lot of information. Whereas now I feel like if I just pulled a random person off the road and started talking about low carbohydrate ketogenic diets, they maybe have a lot of inaccuracies in their mind, but they would be familiar with like the basic idea of that. And it wouldn't be something they would know someone that have a friend. Oh yeah, my buddy so and so they follow that diet, or it's not that uncommon anymore. Um,
Mhm.
so through that, like, I guess, time frame, one thing I've started to kind of notice, and this is probably also just as much like a coincides with just the increase of usage of things like social media, apps that kind of favor short form versus long form, where it feels like there's been a shift from our focus is on the Volek, Finney, D'Agostino type people and their research to there is these recognizable figures that are very much seen as low carb ketogenic advocates, but it's not Finney, Volek, or D'Agostino talking. It's someone who is going to be a lot more polarizing, and they're going to use a lot of what I would consider kind of like half the story at best type rhetoric. And that scares me because my thought about it is if I was coming into the diet today with no information or very little information, and I started just digging in, I'm probably going to find Finney, Volek, and D'Agostino later. I'm going to find the person on social media who's telling you that carbs are evil, carbs are the devil, like everyone should follow a ketogenic diet, that real kind of one-sided absolutist type of view. And my fear is like if you start out in that camp or in that view of it, your likelihood of failing is very high. And we're going to end up with more casualties than success stories. And then the true value of low carbohydrate ketogenic, or for whatever population, percentage of the population that way of eating tends to actually work better for, we're going to end up missing a huge percentage of them and ending up in the long term in a worst case scenario because of people having bad first impressions, I guess, is maybe the way to summarize my kind of overview of the landscape right now. And then the follow up to that would just be like, what is the proper way to go about kind of re-steering the ship, so to speak? Because I do see new people like yourself, who I would say is an excellent communicator for if I would come across you, I would probably be successful in my opinion, because I wouldn't be fed things that are necessarily inaccurate, and I would likely be a lot more structured with it in a sense that it would be like something where I wouldn't be overthinking things that don't really matter that much or underappreciating the actual big components that go into successfully like following the protocol. And I guess to summarize that, like, how do we promote more of you and less of the absolutist so that when new people do come and get introduced, they have what I would consider a good chance of figuring out whether it actually works for them or not.
Yeah. Before providing an answer, I just want to kind of build on some things you said because it was interesting to hear you take it from a basically a clinical perspective. Like, what is the information people are going to latch onto, and how is that going to translate to success or not? Um, which was an interesting place to start because what comes to my mind actually the frustration, despite the fact that right now I'm in my clinical training as a medical student, is actually the scientific end of it. That I see so much potential for ketogenic and low carbohydrate diets for scientific advancement, and I see that massively hindered by the simplistic rhetoric, which creates a really negative stereotype of the community as a whole. and that the scientific progress, which will then translate into the medical progress, is really like given a taint by the people who do come off with really extreme messaging that largely is just inaccurate. And it's interesting because on the few occasions where I've been able, because I know these people in real life, for example, I can maybe name some names later on, stop them and kind of try to explain, look, when you say this is the perception. And here I was literally blocking our ability to perform research. And or because of the taint that is now associated with you, which is completely your fault because you said X, Y, and Z, I actually don't feel comfortable working with you as a collaborator. And they're not even defensive usually. They're like, yeah, I get that. And with respect to, what you mentioned about just the let's say dilution of the low carb space on social media, it becomes very difficult because you have the Dom D'Agostino's, the Finney and Bullocks who say are doing the research and then they want to communicate that research, which is great. But studies take a lot of time to conduct, a lot of time to translate, a lot of time to read. That often goes into the like TLDR category.
Yeah.
Too long didn't read. Whereas things that volume and simplicity gets a lot of engagement, and so the latter is very easy to wash out the former. And it's just a self-perpetuating cycle. That said, I do find there is like an undercurrent of people like you and me who appreciate the more moderate stance of like, look, I'm going to tell you about all the benefits, but with the appropriate caveats and giving the W's where they're deserved for things that aren't in the low carb sphere, because that's actually a more convincing way to kind of progress the science and the broader acceptance of low carbohydrate diets. And what I found is people are actually generally really receptive, even when you push back on their tribe, so to speak. Like I had a tweet about fiber this morning. You read my carnivore tweet before, where I'm like, look, there are benefits here and there are things to be explored, but here are where we go wrong in communicating this message. And pushing so hard sometimes actually creates a hindrance. I don't know if you ever, as a kid, played with oobleck. I'm thinking about that now, but it was like that green substance that,
Oh,
if you like your hand in it, it would just like melt in. But if you tried to punch it, it would be very solid.
yeah.
This weird like mechanical property. I think about Twitter kind of like that, communicating low carb. It's like if you just kind of like gently provide the information and the science, people are usually pretty receptive, even if they're on the other end. But if you try to punch them in the face with a message like sugar is poison, and by the transitive property of fruit is poison, then you've completely lost that
Mhm.
audience member.
Yeah.
So
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. You have more to go
no,
or?
I was just going to say that so finding a way to like balance that middle ground about providing content that's engaging and a little bit of the bait to then transition into the nuance is something I'm trying to work on social media. And over time, I'm finding things that I do think work. And we can talk about them versus don't, but it's definitely very hard. And it takes a lot of like reflection and iteration.